Ukraine is taking back Crimea. Flamingo missiles are striking and destroying FSB facilities on the temporarily occupied peninsula. And together we will discuss what exactly the Ukrainian defense forces are targeting in Crimea. First and foremost, we're talking about Russian air defense systems, which are abundant there, as well as Russian logistics and radar installations. And we'll also talk about what the Partisans are actually doing. After all, the ATESH movement, which essentially monitors the situation in Crimea and serves as the eyes of our intelligence services on the temporarily occupied peninsula, also disrupts the occupiers' logistics, including in the area of temporarily occupied Debaltseve. For example, they recently damaged railway infrastructure and disrupted the delivery of equipment. Meanwhile, the Russians are significantly ramping up the production of missiles and other weapons with the support of North Korea and Iran. By the way, regarding North Korea, there is information that 6,000 military personnel are already undergoing training in the Russian Federation in order to be deployed to the front. We'll talk about this right now, friends, in a short segment. Afterwards, let's return to the studio and discuss all the details. Let's go right now.
Flamingo in action. Ukrainian missiles struck Russian targets in temporarily occupied Crimea. Early in the morning, 3 missiles were launched from the Ukrainian coast. The occupiers failed to intercept any of them, resulting in a strike on a base of Russian border guards, which is overseen by the Federal Security Service of the aggressor country.
According to comprehensive objective control data, as a direct and undeniable result of the precision strike on this particular military base, a total of 6 operational hovercraft and the permanent deployment sites, including all associated infrastructure of the personnel station there, were completely destroyed. It is quite remarkable that the Russian air defense system did not react at all to these aeroballistic strike weapons of the Ukrainian defense forces, which indicates either the depletion of the Russian air defense system in occupied Crimea or the high tactical and technical characteristics of the Ukrainian strike weapon.
In recent weeks, the Ukrainian armed forces have been terrorizing the Russians on the peninsula almost every day. Explosions were heard in Jankoy, Sevastopol, Yevpatoria, and other cities where important military targets of the occupiers were located. As a result of Ukrainian attacks, logistics facilities were put out of action, a train carrying fuel was hit, and a shipborne radar was damaged. Among the destroyed targets were also a unique radio telescope and several modern radar systems, which seriously weakens the enemy's air defense system. Such a successful attack on Crimea was preceded by special reconnaissance, which was carried out the day before from the air by the aviation of Ukraine's partner countries.
There was increased activity of NATO reconnaissance aircraft over the Black Sea. Moreover, several reconnaissance aircraft were operating simultaneously. We are talking about an ultra-modern bomber. It is essentially an analog of the Challenger 650, modified for long-range, high-precision reconnaissance. In addition to this, there was significant activity observed from a United States Navy Boeing Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft. Furthermore, in addition, on the 26th of August, aircraft belonging to the French Air Force were deployed, and subsequently, aircraft of the Royal Air Force of the United Kingdom were also actively involved in the operation.
Meanwhile, Putin's worst nightmare is coming true: NATO troops on Russia's border. In Finland, the regional headquarters of NATO's land forces has officially begun operations. All of this is happening just 140 kilometers from the Russian border and 304 kilometers from St. Petersburg.
First and foremost, this is a political signal to the Russian Federation that Finland is now a full-fledged member of NATO, and accordingly, Article 5 of the NATO Charter on Collective Security applies to Finland. In other words, we can say that this is a clear political signal from the NATO bloc in response to the actions of the Russian Federation, specifically the construction of military bases near the Finnish border. This refers to Petrozavodsk, Kandalaksha, and other settlements on the territory of the Russian Federation.
For its part, Russia continues to ramp up the production of cruise missiles, drones, and artillery with the support of North Korea and Iran, which supply key components and technologies.
This concerns the supply of components for Russian drones from Iran. It is also noteworthy that the plant in Yelabuga, located in the Alabuga Special Economic Zone in Tatarstan, was built with the assistance of Iranian specialists. Regarding North Korea, there is currently information about the transfer from North Korea primarily of strike weapons, specifically the KN-23 and KN-24 ballistic missiles. In addition, the transfer of North Korean-made armored vehicles and artillery shells has been recorded.
And Moscow also wants to produce the Su-57 in India. Russian specialists are conducting studies regarding the amount of investment required to set up fighter jet production. And while Russia is making plans, the Ukrainian armed forces are clearing out the occupiers. Ukrainian forces have liberated the village of Novoye Kononichesko in the Donetsk region and raised the Ukrainian flag there.
Until recently, Novoye Kononichesko served as the main base for the concentration of Russian assault groups. The assault on this settlement lasted for almost a month, and the capture of Novoye Kononichesko is a significant success for Ukraine's defense forces during the stabilization of the situation in the Pokrovsk direction. In addition, let me remind you that the defense forces of Ukraine in the Dobropolsk direction, which is the Pokrovsk district, have deoccupied 7 settlements.
The defense forces of Ukraine have also liberated the village of Udaknoe from the occupiers in the Pokrovsk direction. Meanwhile, agents of the ATESH movement disrupted the supply of Russian equipment near the temporarily occupied Debaltseve by damaging the railway infrastructure.
Ivan Stupak, a military analyst, is joining our broadcast. Ivan, hello. We're glad to see you.
Hello, Zorin. Thank you for the invitation.
Let's start with this. We've already talked about the Flamingos more than once, and now it seems we can finally discuss them in practical terms, not just in theory. At least that's what our publication is reporting right now. So the Flamingos have struck Russian targets in the temporarily occupied Crimea. We're talking about FSB facilities. A base of Russian border guards was hit. In fact, it belongs to the FSB. Well, it's under their direct control. Please tell us what exactly happened here. We always love news from Crimea, especially news like this.
So again, this is unverified information. What is available in open sources is all we have. So it's claimed that this base was hit, and your speaker already mentioned that there were hovercraft involved. To me, it seems a bit strange. Let me explain why hovercraft. Why would we want to hit them? But on the other hand, these were, let's say, the first almost real combat launches at actual targets, apparently ones that weren't heavily protected. And in order to practically confirm that our missiles are able to locate, strike, and inflict significant damage, I think this was justified. It is quite possible that further adjustments to these missiles will be made, as well as adaptation and implementation of some new improvements. After that, we should see some new launches. But again and again, I want to believe that they will be large-scale, that they will be regular. And in this regard, I constantly emphasize that, unfortunately, the Russian special services are not sleeping. They are also searching for the locations where these missiles are produced, as well as the places where their components are manufactured. And we really need to be aware that sooner or later such strikes will be carried out, which could theoretically affect the speed of missile production.
Let's talk more about this further. There is information that Ukrainian military forces are currently cooperating very effectively with Western intelligence agencies. To be precise, in recent days, the strikes on those targets in Crimea, as reported by various outlets including Crimea Realities, were made possible thanks to intelligence and target designation working together. There has been a lot of discussion about whether the United States is providing Ukraine with information and intelligence data or not. As a military expert, do you think that we are working with the information that is provided to us? More specifically, do you think we have access to Western intelligence data when you read such news about the strikes?
Of course, absolutely. Besides, we also have our own data. It's hard for me to say, to pull out from this whole mix what percentage is our own data, how much is Western and how much is American. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter. The main thing is that there are successful strikes, successful hits. This means that Ukraine can see, Ukraine knows where the antennas are, where the defense systems are, and where other important and high-value targets are located. And on the other hand, it no longer matters how Ukraine managed to find out about them, whether it was people on the ground or someone from the Russian military or some Russian support staff who let something slip on an open channel, maybe called home and said, I'll be busy for the next few weeks. A lot of higher-ups have arrived. They brought in some planes and so on. Believe me, that information is more than enough to start planning attacks. Of course, we know that there are many different drones and aircraft in neutral waters over the Black Sea that regularly scan the airwaves and other radio emissions around temporarily occupied Crimea in order to understand what is located where, at what coordinates, and what movements are taking place. In other words, this is invaluable information, but it requires extensive processing. That is, it doesn't mean that the pilots of these planes or the operators immediately see everything they need and instantly pass it on to Ukraine in a ready-to-use form. All this data requires a certain amount of decoding and detailing, and only after that can a strike be planned. In any case, once again, there is information, there are strikes, and that's definitely encouraging.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more. Here's another topic I'd like to touch on. So Putin's worst nightmare, you could say, from a certain perspective, NATO troops on the border of the Russian Federation. Take Finland, for example, which joined NATO relatively recently. For a long time, it didn't join, despite various discussions on the matter. Now, a new NATO military headquarters has been established, located exactly 300 kilometers from St. Petersburg. Tell me, please, from a military standpoint, what does this mean for the Russian Federation? Or do they not pay any attention to these directions at all, understanding that everything is tied up in Ukraine? Well, here we are.
You almost want to say to Valery Gerasimov or the dictator Putin, do you need glasses? There's some kind of enemy NATO headquarters in Finland, but they stubbornly refuse to notice it. And with obsessive persistence, Vladimir Putin keeps talking about how the damned NATO is moving closer to the borders. But for some reason, he chooses not to notice that NATO is already right at the borders. Technically, once again, of course, 300 kilometers is very close. This base, well, it's just a base, it's a headquarters, we understand that. And all the rest of the infrastructure will be stretched along the border with the Russian Federation. There are a little over 1,000 kilometers of shared border, and to St. Petersburg it's basically nothing at all, as they say, just a couple of bytes to send, or like falling down twice. But still, for some reason, all the threat in the Russian Federation is seen exclusively in Ukraine, exclusively in Ukraine's attempt to join the alliance. No one has taken us in yet. In fact, there hasn't even been any discussion about it. But you see, this maniacal persistence has played a cruel joke on the Kremlin. And Ukraine, once again, which is not a member of the alliance, which does not have the infrastructure that NATO has already been actively holding back, without exaggeration, for 1,286 days that huge military machine, which as recently as 2021 was threatening Berlin. Remember? Let's raise an eyebrow. Yes, there or there, no, not an eyebrow. This is about Ukraine. We'll walk to Berlin, but it'll take a little longer to Lisbon, and we'll take Washington. And here we got stuck near the city of Pokrovsk. My God, Pokrovsk. I'll tell you more. Before the war, not every resident of Ukraine knew what kind of city it was. The Russian Federation has been stuck there for a year already, and there haven't been any significant successes. A year since September 2024. That's what can be said about the great Russian machine.
Even I want to ask you about the work of Ukrainian partisans. For example, agents of the ATESH movement disrupted the supply of Russian equipment near the temporarily occupied Debaltseve. We all remember the battles for Debaltseve back in 2014, 2015, 2016. Actually, I think there weren't any in 2016. 2014, it was 2014. So essentially a sabotage operation took place. According to reports from the Partisans, logistics were disrupted and the supply lines for the occupying forces in the Donetsk direction were delayed. Could you please comment on these kinds of special operations behind enemy lines? Could this technology, let's say this instrument of war, become even more widespread? And what impact is it currently having on the Russian occupying forces? How much is it hindering them?
That's an excellent question. Somehow Ukrainian, I'm not sure, partisans, saboteurs, whoever it may be, are managing to infiltrate, well, let's put it this way, quite deep into the occupied territories of Ukraine. By deep, I don't mean 2 or 3 kilometers, but sometimes it's 10 or even 15 kilometers. And from there, they can launch UAVs and drones that are capable of striking all sorts of important targets in places where the Russian Federation definitely does not expect it. Because the way it's usually measured is, here's the line of contact and 5, 7, 10 kilometers from it. That's the maximum range a Ukrainian drone can fly. Beyond that, it's already safe. But it turns out that Ukrainian drones can actually penetrate a bit deeper, more than just 5 or 6 kilometers, into areas where they are definitely not expected. And we saw an excellent video compilation from the main intelligence directorate showing how, quite literally like slicing Moscow sausage, they cut up numerous trains and tankers filled with the diesel fuel and gasoline that are moving through the occupied southern regions of Ukraine. One after another, the drones just slice them up. Everything is on fire, everything is in smoke. And I want to immediately say to our European friends, guys, stop worrying about global warming. We've already missed the boat on all that. Just look at how much fuel is burning, how much war is going on. So there's no need to be afraid of opening military production, of opening factories to produce explosives. There's no need to worry about the beaver population. If all of us, the human inhabitants of Europe, were to tragically disappear, then quite frankly, the beavers themselves would not have any compelling reason to remain on this planet either.
All right. Here's something else I'd like to discuss with you. Belarus. There are Russian soldiers there who came for exercises. There's actually a video we can show our viewers. They're dragging crates of ammunition right into the apartments they're renting there. Residential buildings are essentially being turned into military warehouses. In other words, Russian soldiers are using the residents of Belarus as cover in order to carry out their military activities, or worse yet, to prepare for another attack, possibly not even on Ukraine, but on other European countries. Well, this is essentially what awaits Belarusians who try to ignore who their neighbors are and attempt to be friendly. What is your assessment of what's happening in the video and in general? What exactly is going on during these exercises? What should we be paying attention to?
Let's try to be objective. It's really hard for me as I look closely to say what's inside those boxes. Is it explosives, grenades, ammunition? Is it a planned operation? Or, for example, are these just some random Russian army sergeants taking out 5 or 6 boxes of ammo, hiding them so they can later resell them on the black market? That scenario seems doubtful, but okay, let's assume it's possible. Alternatively, maybe it's, I don't know, alcohol as they say, for drinking and then for their parties. Anything's possible. In any case, we're not watching what's happening in Belarus with interest, but with caution. We are monitoring the preparations underway for these exercises, and we are keeping an eye on the number of military personnel as well as the quality and scale of the equipment being brought in. So far, it's hard to say that there is any significant threat. In other words, nothing of the sort has been observed. But in any case, we are watching closely because we remember how it was in 2021, 2022, actually at the end of 2021 and the beginning of 2022, when it seemed like it was just exercises, but then with a snap of the fingers, a full-scale invasion happened.
Understood. And let's discuss another piece of news. Today I read about how Ukrainian forces finally liberated a village called Udakhne. It is located not far from Pokrovsk. At the very least, it's in the Pokrovsk direction. These are unique shots showing the Ukrainian flag being raised. The clearing of this village happened just in the last few days. Could you please comment on how likely it is that these maneuvers, though I hesitate to naively call it a counteroffensive, but let's say counteroffensive actions in certain areas, could expand? And what is the current situation near Pokrovsk?
All right, let's be objective. We fully understand the size of the Russian army, what it possesses, how many people, equipment, munitions it has, and that it has determined allies. It would seem, after all, that the Russian Federation covers 17 million square kilometers. There is also massive production in North Korea and Iran, which is providing very decisive and at least previously large-scale assistance. It would seem purely arithmetically that the Russian Federation should dominate everywhere. But as it turns out, the Russian Federation can be A, stopped, and B, even in some places locally. We are fully aware of the scale of this counteroffensive. Some previously captured positions on Ukrainian territory can even be retaken from the Russians. Once again, yes, these are small patches of land, small plots that Ukraine is able to reclaim, but at what cost, with what determination and courage all this is achieved, despite the fact that the Russian Federation is larger. According to various estimates, there are about 700,000 Russian Federation servicemen concentrated on the occupied territories of Ukraine and around Ukraine's territory. And this entire mass is pressing down on Ukraine. Despite this, they still find ways to reclaim small areas. This is incredibly motivating for society, showing that we have the ability to do this. The Russian army is not always on the offensive. We are well aware that sooner or later there will be a build-up, both in terms of success and efficiency of the Russian army. There will be additional extra efforts made to regain these positions. But in any case, the more losses the Russian army suffers during their offensive, the more damage we inflict on them, and the more, even if it's just by a percentage or a fraction of a percent, we reduce the overall potential that has been building up against Ukraine over the past 3.5 years.
Thank you so much. Ivan Stupak, military analyst, was on air with Ukraine Today. All the best to you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.